The night was silent, the kind of cold that only the deep winter could bring. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, blanketing the world in a layer of pristine white. The only sounds were the faint creaks of the house settling and the occasional howl of the wind that whipped around the remote cabin nestled deep in the forest. For the Thompson family, this was supposed to be a peaceful evening, a rare chance to escape the noise of the world, to reconnect, and to find some calm. Inside, the warmth of the fire crackling in the living room stove offered a false sense of security. Father, David Thompson, was reading through some old family journals, enjoying the rare tranquility that came with the isolation. His wife, Claire, was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, a hearty stew that filled the cabin with the smell of comfort. Their 2 children, Emily and James, were playing quietly in the corner, their laughter echoing softly through the walls. But beyond the warmth and safety of their home, the world was changing. The news had been grim in recent weeks. First, the reports came in strange, isolated outbreaks of an illness that affected the living. People were becoming different. Aggressive. Destructive. And then, the reports stopped. The power went out across much of the country, and the rest of the world seemed to fade away. In the isolation of their mountain cabin, the Thompsons had been cut off from any information on what was really happening. It wasn't until that evening, as dusk began to fall, that David first noticed something was wrong. A strange, unnatural sound, something that didn't belong in the serene winter landscape, caught his attention. He paused, listening. A low, guttural groan echoed through the stillness of the night. It was distant but unmistakable. At first, he assumed it was an animal, but there was something about the sound that sent a chill down his spine. "Claire," he called, his voice tight with unease. She didn't hear him at first, her focus on stirring the pot of stew. When she did glance up, David's expression was enough to make her pause. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, heavier. "What's wrong?" she asked, walking over to him. "I think I heard something outside," he replied, his gaze fixed on the window that overlooked the snowy forest. Claire frowned, brushing her hands on her apron. "Could be just the wind," she suggested, though there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. David wasn't so sure. He stepped toward the window, pulling the thick curtains aside. The fading light of the day revealed only the endless stretch of snow-covered trees and the gentle curve of the mountains in the distance. But the groaning sound had grown louder, closer now, and he knew that it wasn't the wind. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "We should lock the doors," he said, his voice low. "Just in case." Claire hesitated, but the look in his eyes made her act without question. She hurried to the front door, securing the deadbolt and checking the windows. Emily and James, oblivious to the tension building, continued their play, though Emily's gaze kept drifting toward the door as if sensing her parents' unease. David stepped out onto the porch, scanning the area. The world seemed eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made every rustle in the snow seem louder than it was. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he waited, straining his ears for any sign of movement. Then, he saw it. A shadow, moving erratically among the trees. David froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure seemed too large, too unnatural to be a person. He instinctively took a step back into the cabin, slamming the door behind him. "What is it?" Claire asked, her voice a mixture of concern and fear. "There's something out there," he said, his breath quickening. "It's not a person." The door creaked ominously, as if something heavy had brushed against it. David's eyes widened. It wasn't just one. There were more. Claire's hands shook as she backed away from the door, the reality of what they might be facing sinking in. The kids were now looking at them, their faces pale with confusion. "Mom? Dad?" Emily asked quietly, sensing the change in the atmosphere. David swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. "Stay away from the windows," he ordered. "Both of you." The house felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were closing in. David's mind raced. What were they supposed to do? Who could they turn to for help? They were isolated, alone in the wilderness with no way to contact the outside world. And the creatures outside, they were no longer human. Whatever they were coming closer. As the first thudding steps of something large and heavy shook the ground outside, David knew that the night had only just begun. In the distance, the low groan of the creatures rose again, a haunting chorus that seemed to carry through the air like a death knell. And with that sound, the Thompson family realized, the coldest night of their lives had just begun. The wind howled outside, but the noise was drowned out by the growing sound of heavy footsteps that seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin. David's mind raced as he hurried to lock all the windows and doors, his hands trembling with the urgency of the moment. The snowstorm had shielded them from the outside world, but it was no longer just a peaceful winter evening. Something worse was coming, and it wasn't the weather. "Dad, what's happening?" James' voice cracked, breaking through David's chaotic thoughts. The child was holding Emily's hand tightly, his face pale with fear. David glanced at his wife, Claire, who was holding on to Emily with a white-knuckled grip. Their eyes met, and the unspoken fear between them was palpable. They had no idea what they were dealing with, but it was clear now that they were not safe. "Listen to me," David said in a voice that was more for his own reassurance than theirs. "We need to stay calm. Whatever's out there, we can handle it as long as we stick together. Stay inside, away from the windows, and don't make a sound unless I tell you to." Claire nodded, her lips tight. She couldn't speak, but the terror in her eyes was enough. She grabbed the nearest kitchen knife, a desperate measure, but one that made her feel slightly less helpless. Emily and James huddled together in the corner, their wide eyes constantly shifting from their parents to the windows. David stood by the front door, his back against the cold wood, straining to hear the slightest sound. The heavy footsteps had stopped, but the groaning continued, a low, rasping noise that made his skin crawl. What kind of creatures could make such a sound? Suddenly, there was a loud bang against the door, as if something had thrown itself against it. The sound echoed through the house, vibrating the walls. David's heart leaped into his throat. "Everyone, get back," he shouted, shoving Claire and the kids away from the door. There was no time to think, no time to plan. Only survival. He grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, and held it in front of him like a weapon. The kids gasped as he moved towards the door, his mind racing through possible scenarios. He had no idea what they were up against, but the sheer force of the impact told him that these things outside were not normal. Another thud, this time accompanied by a high-pitched shriek, more human than animal. It sounded like it was right outside. David pressed his ear to the door, straining to hear through the thick, cold wood. There was a muffled shuffling, and then the unmistakable sound of something dragging itself across the porch. A cold wave of dread washed over him. "They're here." Claire's face drained of color as she pulled Emily and James even farther back, toward the farthest corner of the cabin. She whispered to them, though David could tell she was trying to keep her own fear at bay for their sake. "We'll be okay," she said, though her voice wavered. "We'll be okay." But David wasn't so sure. The creatures outside weren't human. They moved with an unnatural jerking, dragging themselves across the snow. The shrieks, mixed with groans, told him that whatever had happened in the world, it had reached them now. Whatever disease, whatever curse had taken hold of the human race, it had spread fast. Suddenly, another loud crash echoed from the back of the cabin. David spun around, his heart pounding. "Claire, move!" They all rushed toward the back of the house, the sound of glass shattering behind them. He could hear the shuffling and moaning growing closer, the pounding of something, or someone, breaking through. The family rushed into the kitchen, and David slammed the door behind them, quickly barricading it with anything he could find, a chair, a heavy wooden shelf, a broom. He didn't know if it would be enough, but it was all they had. "Dad, what's out there?" James asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, as if speaking louder would attract whatever was out there. "I don't know, son," David said, his voice strained. "But whatever it is, it's not human. We need to stay quiet and stay hidden." They waited in silence, the only sound the rattling of the door as the creatures outside banged against it. The cold crept into the room, making the family shiver despite the warmth of the kitchen stove. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. The room felt like it was shrinking with every passing second. Then, through the crack of the door, David saw it. A pale hand, yellowed and cracked, reached out from the other side of the doorframe. The fingers curled, scrabbling at the wood, as if trying to force their way in. David's breath caught in his throat. He could see the creature now, a thing that had once been human. Its eyes were cloudy, lifeless, and its skin was mottled with patches of decay. It groaned as it twisted its head, as if searching for its prey. He didn't know how many more were out there. But there was no time left to think. The fight for survival had begun. The night outside was colder than ever, the snow falling faster, but inside, it was much worse. The room felt impossibly small now, the walls closing in with each passing second. The distant howls and thuds from outside were constant, an eerie reminder that the undead were closing in. David's heart pounded, but he forced himself to focus. His family's safety was all that mattered now. He turned to Claire, who was holding the children tightly, her face pale but determined. "We can't stay here forever," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to figure out how to get out of here." Claire nodded, but her eyes were filled with doubt. "How, David? There are too many of them. We can't outrun them. We have to stay inside." David's eyes flickered back toward the door, where the creature's hand was still scraping against the wood, leaving shallow gouges in the surface. It had been joined by others. He could hear them moving, their growls growing louder and more frantic, their presence more overwhelming by the second. "They're getting through," Claire whispered, a tremor in her voice. "David, what if we don't make it out of here?" David swallowed hard. He couldn't let the fear consume him. "We'll make it," he said, more for his own reassurance than hers. "I promise." He glanced around the kitchen, trying to think quickly. They had to find a way to defend themselves. There was no way to escape without risking being seen, so their only option was to make a stand. The back door was barricaded, but it wouldn't hold for long. The creatures were relentless, and if they were as strong as David feared, the door wouldn't survive much longer. He needed to come up with a plan, and fast. He walked over to the window above the sink, carefully pulling the curtain aside just a fraction to get a look outside. The storm raged on, but through the blinding snow, David could make out the outlines of several more of the undead moving through the trees, drawn to the cabin like moths to a flame. Some of them were staggering aimlessly, while others were standing still, almost as if waiting for something. The sight sent a cold wave of fear through him. The creatures outside weren't just random stragglers. They were organized. He pulled back from the window quickly, his mind working at full speed. There had to be something they could use as a weapon. His eyes scanned the room. There was a heavy cast iron skillet on the counter, a few knives in the drawer, a broken chair leg, anything that could give them a fighting chance. Claire's voice broke through his thoughts. "David, they're getting closer." He turned to see Claire and the children huddling in the corner, their eyes wide with terror. The kids had been trying to stay calm, but the sounds outside were becoming too much for them. Emily's face was streaked with tears, and James had his hands over his ears, as if trying to block out the noise. "Stay close to me," David said, moving toward them. He picked up the heavy skillet, feeling its weight in his hands. It wasn't much, but it was something. "We're not giving up. Not tonight." As if on cue, there was another crash from the back door. The barricade rattled, and then a loud snap. The creatures had broken through. They were inside. The first one stumbled into the kitchen, its eyes vacant, its mouth agape in an endless groan. It was followed by two more, their slow, jerky movements eerily synchronized as they entered the cabin. The smell was unbearable, decay, rot, the stench of death. David didn't hesitate. With a roar of adrenaline, he swung the skillet at the closest creature, landing a heavy blow to its head. The thing staggered back but didn't fall. It snarled, reaching out with its long, bony fingers, trying to grab him. Claire screamed as she grabbed the kitchen knife, rushing forward to help. She swung it with a desperate strength, slashing at the creature's arm, but it barely seemed to register the hit. The undead thing recoiled for a moment, but its empty eyes locked onto hers. David didn't have time to think. He pulled Claire back just as another undead creature appeared at the doorway. He kicked the first one hard, sending it stumbling across the kitchen floor, but the second one lunged forward, grabbing hold of his arm with an inhuman strength. The pain in his arm was intense, but he fought back, slamming the skillet down on the creature's skull. The thing let out a loud hiss as it crumpled to the floor. David turned back to Claire, who was now holding Emily and James close. The children's eyes were wide with fear, but they weren't making a sound. "We need to get out of here," David said, panting. He was exhausted already, but he couldn't stop. They couldn't stay here any longer. The house wasn't secure. The creatures were too many. He dashed to the window, pushing aside the curtain again. Outside, the undead had spread out, wandering through the snow. They were moving closer, and more seemed to be drawn to the cabin by the second. There was no time left to wait. "Claire, get the kids," David said urgently. "We're making a run for it. We need to move now." Claire hesitated, then nodded, her face a mask of resolve. She gathered the children quickly, the urgency of the situation hitting her like a punch to the gut. David turned to the door and grabbed the broken chair leg, holding it up as a makeshift weapon. He didn't know how far they would make it, but they had no other choice. With one final look at the creatures outside, too many to count, moving slowly but steadily toward them, David pushed open the kitchen window and helped his family climb through. The cold air hit them like a slap to the face, but there was no time to adjust. They had to move quickly. The night had only just begun. The snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the ground beneath their feet, making every step a struggle. The cold cut through their clothes like needles, but there was no time to feel the chill. David pushed ahead, his breath coming in quick bursts, as his family followed closely behind. Every crunch of snow beneath their boots seemed to echo in the stillness, though the sounds of the undead outside were far louder. They were everywhere. The groans, the guttural snarls, and the dragging footsteps came from all directions. David glanced over his shoulder, checking on Claire and the kids. Emily was clutching her mother's hand, her face pale with fear but determined. James, though, was lagging behind, his face contorted with exhaustion and fear. "We can't stop," David called over his shoulder, his voice sharp. "Keep moving. We're almost there." Claire nodded but didn't speak. The kids didn't need to be told. The terror on their faces said everything. They had to keep moving or risk being overtaken. The wind howled louder, almost as if the night itself was conspiring against them. Visibility was near zero, and the snowstorm made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. David's heart raced as he fought to keep the panic from overtaking him. Every instinct told him to get to shelter, but where? The woods were vast, and they had no idea where the nearest help might be. The cabin, now overrun, was a distant memory, a reminder of how quickly things had escalated. They reached the edge of the trees, where the forest gave way to a wide, frozen clearing. The path they were following had been used before, though it hadn't been maintained in years. There was an old, abandoned barn a few hundred yards away, its silhouette barely visible against the dark backdrop of the storm. David remembered the path leading to it. It had once been a shortcut to a nearby town, a place where they might find help. If there was any help left. There, David pointed. The barn. "We'll make it there, then figure out our next move." Claire's gaze followed his finger, and she nodded. "Okay. Let's go." But the moment they started moving again, the unmistakable sounds of the undead grew louder. They were closing in, drawn to the family's scent. The groans, now sharper and more urgent, told David that the creatures were getting closer, much closer. Suddenly, the loud crack of breaking branches rang out through the storm. A figure, its face half-rotted and covered in snow, burst from the trees, its eyes locked onto David. It snarled, a twisted snarl that was more animal than human, and it lunged toward him, its hands outstretched. David barely had time to react. Instinctively, he grabbed the chair leg, swinging it with all his might. The creature staggered backward, but it didn't fall. Its jagged teeth snapped in the air as it regained its footing and tried again. But David was faster this time. He jabbed the makeshift weapon into the creature's chest, the force pushing it back with a horrible crack. It fell to the snow with a sickening thud. "Go!" David shouted, adrenaline pumping through his veins. Claire and the kids had stopped, wide-eyed in shock, but they didn't need to be told twice. They ran, fear propelling them forward, toward the barn. David followed close behind, his eyes scanning the forest for any more signs of movement. But just as they reached the clearing near the barn, another figure emerged from the trees, a second undead, then a third. They moved with terrifying speed, their eyes fixed on the family like prey. "Stay close!" David yelled, turning to face the approaching creatures. The first creature lunged at him, its hands reaching for his throat. He swung the chair leg again, knocking it backward, but the force of the impact sent him stumbling. His footing faltered, and for a moment, he felt a cold hand grab his ankle. The creature was fast, too fast. It hissed, pulling itself closer with terrifying strength. Claire screamed from behind him, but David didn't have time to react. He kicked out with all his strength, sending the creature tumbling to the snow, but he could feel more closing in on him. "David!" Claire shouted, her voice high with panic. He turned just in time to see his family reach the barn door. Claire yanked it open with all her strength, and Emily and James scrambled inside. But David wasn't there yet. He was still fighting, his breath ragged as he swung the chair leg once more, connecting with the head of another undead that had come too close. "Get inside, now," he shouted, pushing the last of the creatures back. Claire's face was a mask of fear and determination. "David, hurry," she cried. With one last, desperate push, David shoved the final creature away and dove toward the barn door. Claire slammed it shut behind him just as the undead reached the entrance. The family was safe, for the moment. But the barn wasn't much better than the cabin. It was old, dilapidated, and the cold seemed to seep from the very walls. It didn't matter. They had to survive. There was nowhere else to go. David took a moment to catch his breath, his heart still racing. He turned toward his family, his hands trembling as he tried to steady himself. "We're not out of danger yet," he said, his voice hoarse. "We need to stay quiet. They'll hear us if we make any noise." The kids huddled together, their faces still full of fear. Claire knelt down beside them, wrapping her arms around Emily and James to keep them calm. David glanced around the barn. There was little to work with. Some old hay bales, a few broken tools, and not much else. He had to think. They needed warmth, supplies, anything to survive the night. Outside, the wind howled even louder than before, and David could hear the low moans of the undead still searching. The barn wasn't going to hold forever. But for now, it was all they had. The night stretched on, cold and unforgiving. And as the minutes turned to hours, David realized one horrifying truth: the night wasn't just cold, it was endless. The barn creaked and groaned in the wind, a hollow, eerie sound that sent shivers down David's spine. The cold seemed to be seeping into his bones, and his fingers were numb despite the heavy gloves he'd put on earlier. He'd always thought of the snowstorm as an inconvenience in the past, something that kept him indoors and forced him to cancel plans. Now, in the middle of this nightmare, it felt like the storm itself was conspiring against them, isolating them further from any hope of rescue. David sat against the wall, his eyes scanning the barn. The kids were huddled together, quietly whispering to each other, trying their best not to cry. Claire, sitting across from them, kept glancing toward the door, her face drawn with worry. She was clearly exhausted, her eyelids heavy with the weight of the day's horrors, but she didn't dare close her eyes for long. They all knew how quickly things could turn. "We need to make sure they don't get in," David murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Claire nodded, her eyes dark with fear. "How, David? We have nothing here. The door won't hold for long." David looked around the barn again. The door was weak, barely hanging on its hinges after years of neglect. The barn had been abandoned for decades, but the sudden influx of undead had made the place feel more like a trap than a refuge. He couldn't let his mind wander too far into despair. There had to be something they could use. His eyes caught the faint outline of a rusty pitchfork, leaning against the far wall. A broken ladder lay nearby. The barn, despite its derelict state, still had some old tools that could serve as weapons, even if they weren't ideal. "We'll have to make do," David said, pushing himself to his feet. His legs ached, and his muscles were stiff from the cold, but the urgency of the situation gave him the strength to keep moving. He walked over to the pitchfork, grabbing it and testing its weight. It was heavy, the prongs long and sharp, but it would have to suffice. Claire joined him, picking up the broken ladder and using it as a makeshift barricade for the door. The barn door was flimsy at best, and David didn't trust it to hold against a determined attack. He had no illusions about their chances of survival if the undead broke through. The barn would be their final stand. "Do you think anyone is coming for us?" Claire's voice was soft, tinged with the raw edge of doubt. David didn't answer right away. He had thought about it, hoped for it, but he didn't want to give her false hope. The world they had known was gone, and they were on their own now. "I don't know," he said, his voice flat. "But we can't wait for help. We have to survive." Outside, the wind howled again, a reminder of how isolated they were. The storm had only grown worse, the snow piling up in thick drifts. They couldn't even see the creatures through the frosted windows, but they could hear them, their low growls, their rasping breaths as they shuffled through the snow. Every so often, a thud or the crack of a breaking branch pierced the air, and David's grip tightened around the pitchfork. "I don't want to die here," Emily whispered, her voice small. David's heart twisted. He turned to face her, forcing a smile despite the dread gnawing at his insides. "You won't. We'll get through this. We just need to stay quiet and stay calm." James, normally the quiet one, had a look of defiance in his eyes. "We'll make it, won't we, Dad? We can fight them off." David hesitated for just a second before nodding. "Yes. We can. But we need to be smart. We'll take shifts and keep watch. As long as we stay calm, we'll make it through the night." The hours dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. The barn, cold and bare, became their prison. The air grew thicker with the smell of fear, sweat, and the rotting scent that permeated from the undead outside. It wasn't just the cold that pressed in on them, it was the constant threat of death, waiting for them just beyond the fragile wooden door. David took the first watch, gripping the pitchfork tightly in his hands. He stared out the small, grimy window, his eyes scanning the darkened shapes moving outside. It was difficult to see through the storm, but he knew they were there, lurking, just out of reach, patient. Too patient. A distant growl sent a shiver down his spine. The creatures were out there, and they weren't going anywhere. His thoughts raced as he tried to think of a way to fortify the barn, to make sure they had enough time to escape if they needed to. But every plan he came up with seemed futile. They were trapped in this frozen wasteland with no way out. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the barn. David's heart leapt in his chest, and he spun toward the door. His pulse quickened as he heard the unmistakable sound of something large slamming into the wood. They were testing the barricade. He rushed over to Claire, his voice low but urgent. "They're trying to get in. We need to hold this door at all costs." Claire's face went pale, but she nodded and moved to reinforce the ladder, pushing with all her strength. David joined her, putting his weight against the door as the undead outside continued their assault. The barn door groaned under the pressure, but it held, for now. The hours passed like this, with the creatures outside growing more restless, their groans more frantic. Every so often, one would try to break through, only to be met with the sound of the barricade holding firm. But David knew it was only a matter of time before they wore it down. Outside, the storm raged on, and the wind began to pick up, howling louder than before. The creatures, now fully aware of the family's presence, seemed to be closing in from every direction. In the oppressive silence of the barn, all David could hear was the heavy breathing of his family and the growls of the undead getting closer. There was no escaping the horror of the night. The cold had taken hold of them all, but it was the undead that would be their true enemy. They just needed to survive until the storm passed. But would it ever end? The night dragged on in an agonizing crawl, with the cold and darkness pressing in from every side. The snowstorm outside showed no signs of letting up, and the wind howled like a living thing, battering against the barn's fragile walls. It had been hours since the first attack, and David's body ached from the tension and strain of holding the door against the growing threat. His hands were raw from gripping the pitchfork, and his fingers were numb from the cold, but he couldn't allow himself to rest. Every sound, every shift of the wind made him alert, on edge. David couldn't help but glance over at his family. Claire was sitting with Emily and James, trying her best to keep them calm, but even she couldn't hide the exhaustion on her face. Her eyes were bloodshot, her skin pale from the cold and stress. She had hardly slept since the attack began. Neither of them had. The kids were trying to remain strong, but the fear was visible in their eyes, despite their efforts to look brave. Emily clung to Claire, her little hands trembling with every noise, while James had become quieter, his face a mask of determination and fear. David could see it in his son's eyes. He was trying so hard to be strong, to hold it together for the family. But it wasn't enough. No amount of bravery could shield them from the horrors outside. The groans of the undead grew louder now. David could hear them scratching at the door, their hands pressing against the wood, and their hissing breath filling the air. The creatures outside were relentless. As the minutes passed, their movements seemed to grow more frenzied, more determined. The realization was slowly sinking in, this might be their last stand. The door could only hold for so long. David's gaze flicked to the window again. Through the storm, he could barely make out the shadows of the undead, their shapes blurry and indistinct, but he knew they were out there. They weren't just at the door anymore, they were circling the barn, waiting. Testing. The longer they waited, the more David could feel his resolve slipping. "We're running out of time," Claire whispered, her voice tight with fear. She had been keeping the kids occupied, trying to distract them from the noise outside, but it was clear she was losing hope. "I know," David replied softly, his voice rough from the strain. "We can't stay here much longer." The barn door rattled as another powerful force struck it, the sound vibrating through the thin wood. David's heart raced. He shoved his shoulder against the door once more, trying to reinforce the weak barricade. It was clear now, soon, the door would give way. A muffled scream tore through the air. It wasn't from their family, but it was close. David's head whipped around, his heart stopping for a beat. The undead. They had found someone else. The scream was followed by a horrid, crunching sound, the sound of something large and breaking. The moans of the undead grew louder, and David knew they were feeding, tearing into whatever poor soul had been caught outside. He didn't want to think about it, but the image of the thing outside clawing at its prey was burned into his mind. "Stay down," David ordered, his voice low and intense. Claire quickly pulled the kids closer, hiding behind the hay bales, her hand tight around their shoulders. David moved cautiously to the window again, peering through the frost-coated glass. Through the blur of snow, he could see the silhouette of a lone figure stumbling across the clearing, dragging its feet as it drew closer to the barn. The sight made his blood run cold. He couldn't be sure, but it looked like someone had been caught in the storm, another survivor? Or just another victim? But before he could process the thought further, the figure collapsed. David's breath caught in his throat. A group of undead closed in on the fallen person, their grotesque figures moving in a chaotic frenzy. The shadows shifted, and in the dim light, David could just make out the unmistakable tearing of flesh. His stomach lurched, and he had to turn away from the window. "We need to get out of here," Claire's voice broke through the fog of his thoughts. David turned back to his wife, his face hardening. He had been trying to come up with a plan, something, anything, that would give them a chance to escape. But the barn, the storm, and the growing number of undead outside were closing in on them with every passing minute. "There's no way out through the door," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But the roof, maybe we can make it to the roof and escape. Claire's eyes widened with panic. The roof? It's too high. We'll never make it. David grabbed a nearby piece of wood, using it to pound against the barn's walls, looking for any weak spots. If they could get up onto the roof, they could move through the storm and find some kind of shelter. But it wasn't an easy plan. The barn was old, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow, and the climb up would be treacherous. It's our only chance, David said, his mind racing. The door won't hold for much longer. We have to move. The barn door rattled again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable creak of the wood starting to splinter. David's pulse quickened. The creatures were relentless. They were almost there. David turned to Claire. Get the kids ready. We're moving to the roof. Claire hesitated for a split second, fear flashing in her eyes. But then she nodded, gathering Emily and James. The kids were terrified, but they trusted their parents. They had no choice but to follow. David moved quickly, shoving aside old barrels and debris in search of something to help them climb. His eyes landed on the broken ladder. He could use it to reach the roof. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. Outside, the pounding on the door intensified, the undead shrieking and clawing at the weakened wood. David didn't have much time. He grabbed the ladder, propping it up against the side of the barn. The moment it was in place, he started to climb, his heart pounding in his chest. Claire followed with the kids, making sure they climbed one at a time. As David reached the top, he glanced back at his family, Claire, Emily, and James, all struggling to follow. The barn door was starting to break apart. The storm was howling louder, and the winds seemed to grow colder as he pulled himself onto the roof, reaching down to help Claire and the kids. They were nearly there. Just as the last of them climbed onto the roof, the barn door splintered, crashing to the ground. The undead were inside. David looked back one last time before the wind swallowed the sounds of the barn's destruction. The family was now on the roof, frozen, exposed, and surrounded by nothing but snow. They had escaped one nightmare, but the storm was only just beginning. The wind screamed through the night, whipping the snow into furious, blinding flurries. David's breath came out in thick clouds of mist, his heart hammering as he crouched low on the snow-covered roof, his body tense and aching from the climb. The cold was unbearable, but it wasn't the chill that had his nerves frayed, it was the deafening silence that had settled over them. The barn was gone, a crumpled mass of broken wood, and the horde of undead was inside, swarming like mindless predators. The family was now exposed to the full force of the storm, the snow so thick they couldn't see more than a few feet in front of them. David turned to check on Claire and the kids, their faces pale and frozen with fear. Emily was huddled close to Claire, her face pressed against her mother's coat as she tried to keep warm. James stood a little apart, his wide eyes scanning the dark horizon, searching for any sign of movement. "Dad, are we safe here?" Emily's voice, soft and fragile, trembled in the air. David swallowed hard, forcing a reassuring smile even though the words tasted like ashes in his mouth. "For now, sweetheart. For now." But he knew better than to believe his own words. This roof, this fragile sliver of refuge, wasn't safe. Not by a long shot. The storm was masking their movements, but it was also obscuring the undead, making them harder to spot, harder to avoid. David's eyes darted around the bleak, snow-covered landscape. The barn was gone, and with it, the only shelter they'd had. They were now stuck in the open, isolated, and vulnerable. "I don't see them anymore," James said, his voice tight with nerves. Maybe we can go back and find another place to hide?" David shook his head. "We can't go back. They'll be waiting for us. They're already inside the barn. We're better off moving away from here." But where could they go? The storm made it impossible to navigate, the snowbanks rising high as the winds blew their path out of sight. It was as if the world had turned into a frozen wasteland, leaving them stranded in the cold with no safe haven in sight. Claire glanced at David, her voice low but filled with an urgency he couldn't ignore. "We can't stay out here forever. We need to find shelter. I know, David replied, his voice gruff. We just need to keep moving. But where? There was nothing but the snow, a vast empty expanse that seemed to stretch on forever. Even the sounds of the undead were muffled now, the wind howling louder than the growls that had once sent them into a frenzy of fear. It was as if the world had gone to sleep, and they were the only ones left awake to face the nightmare. Minutes turned into hours. The wind had become a constant presence, a cruel companion that ripped at their clothes and numbed their skin. Each gust felt like a slap against their faces, and the cold burned through their bones. Yet they couldn't stop. They couldn't give up. Not now. David was about to suggest they move when the first sound broke through the howling storm. A low, guttural growl, a sound David knew all too well. His heart skipped a beat, and his gaze shot to the edges of the roof. At first, he couldn't see anything, only the endless white of the storm. But then, through the snow, he saw them. Shadows. Figures moving slowly, purposefully, in their direction. The undead. They had found them. David's pulse quickened. Get down, he hissed, pulling Claire and the kids close to the edge of the roof. His eyes scanned the figures below, trying to make out how many of them there were. He didn't know if they had heard the family, but he couldn't risk being caught off guard. We need to move. Now. Claire's face turned white, but she nodded quickly, her hands trembling as she grabbed hold of James and Emily. David's mind raced. They couldn't stay on the roof. It wasn't high enough to offer them real protection, and the snow would make their next move even more dangerous. The roof's slanted edge would be treacherous in these conditions. He needed a plan, and fast. We need to get down and into the woods, he said, his voice clipped with urgency. There's a grove of trees up ahead. It's our best shot. Is it safe? Claire asked, her voice shaky. The uncertainty in her eyes mirrored his own fears. No, David replied bluntly. But it's better than being out in the open. The growls below were getting louder, closer. The undead were shuffling through the snow, their stumbling, erratic movements inching toward the barn ruins. David had no illusions. If they stayed up here any longer, they would be trapped, surrounded by the horde with nowhere to run. Stay close to me, David said, as he carefully began to slide down the edge of the roof. He moved slowly, testing his footing with every step. His heart pounded in his chest as he focused on the ground below, the snow slick with ice. He could feel the weight of the pitchfork in his hands, his only weapon now. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to buy them a few precious seconds. One by one, the family descended from the roof, Claire helping the kids as best she could. It felt like an eternity, but eventually, they were all safely on the ground. David scanned the surroundings once more, making sure they weren't surrounded. There was a narrow gap between the barn ruins and the trees, barely visible in the storm, but it offered them a potential route to escape. Go, David ordered, pushing the family ahead. Move quickly. They had no time to hesitate. The undead were getting closer, and the snowstorm was only making the situation worse. Visibility was low, and every footstep they made in the snow seemed to echo in the eerie silence. The groans of the undead seemed to be all around them, though they couldn't yet see them clearly. The family moved as fast as they could, each step heavy with the knowledge that they were running out of time. David held his breath, listening for the sound of footsteps behind them, praying that they wouldn't be caught. But the worst was yet to come. As they reached the trees, David could see it, the shape of the undead, lurking just ahead, moving toward them through the storm. They were surrounded. The hunt had begun. The trees loomed ahead like dark sentinels in the storm, their branches creaking under the weight of the snow. The wind howled through the forest, but it was the low growls of the undead that truly sent chills down David's spine. His heart was racing, but there was no time to think, only to move. The trees provided some cover, but not enough to escape the ever-growing horde closing in on them from all sides. David turned back to his family. Claire's eyes were wide with fear, but her determination to protect their children was clear in her face. She had Emily clutched tightly in her arms, while James, though pale, kept moving with a sense of grim resolve. There was no time for comfort now. They had to keep going. David's grip on the pitchfork tightened. It felt like a meager defense against the creatures that were stalking them, but it was all he had left. He glanced around, trying to figure out their next move. The storm was thick, and the trees ahead seemed to offer some shelter, but they would have to be quick. The undead were close. "Claire," David said in a low, urgent voice, "take the kids to that cluster of trees ahead. I'll hold them off." Claire's eyes filled with uncertainty and fear. "David, no. We stay together." "I'll catch up," he insisted. "I can buy you a few seconds. Just go, now." It was clear from her expression that she wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. The undead were too close. They couldn't wait any longer. "Be careful," she whispered before turning, pulling the kids with her toward the trees. Her voice was filled with the kind of fear that only a mother could understand, but there was no time to comfort her now. David took one last glance at them before turning to face the oncoming danger. The wind stung his skin, but his senses were sharp, his focus entirely on the threat ahead. Through the swirling snow, he could make out the figures of the undead, mangled, grotesque bodies moving with terrifying purpose. David's breath was shallow, his thoughts racing. He needed to buy them just enough time to get into the woods and out of view. The pitchfork felt heavy in his hands, but he gripped it tightly, ready for whatever came. The first of the undead staggered into view, a twisted man, his face pale and slack, his clothes torn. His eyes were vacant, his mouth dripping with frothy saliva as he moaned lowly, its attention now on David. More appeared behind him, each one just as relentless and determined. David took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His heart hammered in his chest as the first of the undead shuffled closer. The pitchfork was his only weapon, he had to use it to his advantage. As the creature lurched toward him, David lunged forward, stabbing the pitchfork into its chest with all his strength. The creature screeched as the prongs of the fork sunk deep into its flesh, and for a moment, David thought it might fall. But then it kept coming, relentless, as if it didn't feel the pain. With a grunt, David yanked the pitchfork free, pushing the creature away. It staggered backward, but not for long. Another undead stepped forward, closer this time, and David raised the pitchfork, ready to strike again. He could feel the sweat on his brow, despite the freezing cold. His body screamed in exhaustion, but there was no stopping now. He couldn't afford to hesitate. The next one came in a blur of motion. David thrust the pitchfork forward again, hitting the creature in the stomach. It hissed in agony, its jaws snapping at the air. David shoved it back and barely had time to adjust before another one closed in. He was getting surrounded. A sharp groan echoed from behind him, and David twisted to see another undead, its outstretched hands reaching toward him. He had no choice but to fight, each strike and thrust becoming more frantic. The pitchfork was his only line of defense, and every moment felt like an eternity. His body was growing numb from the cold, and he could feel his strength waning. Sweat mixed with snow on his brow, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the undead pressed closer. He stumbled back, swinging the pitchfork desperately. The creatures closed in, and David's hope began to fade. He could hear Claire's voice in his mind, her desperate plea for him to return to her. He thought of Emily, of James, and the sacrifices they had already made just to survive. He couldn't let them down now. Suddenly, a distant scream cut through the chaos. "Claire!" David's heart stopped, panic gripping him. He looked over his shoulder, toward the trees. They had been moving toward them, but now they were distant. Something had happened. David's blood ran cold as the screams echoed again, followed by a horrible growl. He couldn't see Claire or the kids anymore. Had they been caught? No, not now. Not after everything they had endured. David pushed forward, slamming his pitchfork into the creature closest to him. It staggered back, but it didn't stop. David was growing weaker by the second. But he couldn't let them get any closer. His legs were giving out. The weight of the storm, the exhaustion, and the pressure of the fight had pushed him to his limits. The pitchfork slipped from his grip, falling to the snow with a soft thud. But it wasn't over yet. Through the blur of snow, David saw a shadow, a silhouette in the distance. Claire? Emily? James? They were moving, but they were too far. They were still in danger. David knew, as the undead swarmed him from all sides, that this was the end of his fight. But he had bought them time. He had bought his family time. With a final breath, he reached for the knife at his belt, determined to protect them to the last. And then everything went black. The storm raged on as the night swallowed David's sacrifice, leaving only the distant howls of the undead and the silence of a world frozen in time.